Hello, everybody. My name is Aaron Hawkins. I'm also known as Storm Clouds Gathering, and today we're here again with Stuart Rhodes of the Oath Keepers. We got talking about how even one soldier standing up can be enough to turn the rest of their unit and to give them the courage to resist unlawful orders as well. And it's really interesting because this reminded me of the Ash conformity experiments. If those of you who are out there aren't familiar with that, you can Google it and you can find information on this study because it's actually been repeated multiple times. And it was a case where they took a group of individuals, about 120 something people, and they showed them a series of lines that were very clear and easy to distinguish, and asked them which one was longer. And it was a trick experiment because they basically had the majority of the classroom was fake. They were just there to test this one individual and to see what he was going to do. And what they did is they all said the wrong thing. The group said the wrong thing. And what he was testing is how many people would go along to that wrong statement. And what he was surprised to discover is that a large percentage of people would go along with these absolutely ridiculous claims when, like, a short line that's very clearly half the length of the other one, and if the group was saying it was the other one was the long one, then they would go along with it, unless one person in a room disagreed. That was enough to drastically shift the entire situation. So I was wondering if you could go into that in relation to the military, because the military it's a very regimented organization, and people have a lot of serious consequences for disobeying.
Right. So we talked yesterday, the last time we talked. One good example is Warrant Officer Thompson in the My Lai massacre. Of course, he was from outside that unit, so it's a little bit different, but nonetheless, one person in the right place at the right time to make a huge difference. And the other example that we use, which is it's really interesting that you brought that study because it is reflected in real life. You look at the example of Staff Sergeant Joshua May from the Utah National Guard. This is a Guard unit deployed during Hurricane Katrina. And that at first they're deployed from the Utah into a rural area in Louisiana where, the locals had already formed up their own ad hoc militias and were securing their own town against looters. Anybody might try to take advantage of the chaos. And so when they landed into this rural area, once the locals realized they weren't there to take their guns, then things relaxed quite a bit and actually helped each other an awful lot. But then they were told they're going to deploy into New Orleans itself, and that's when things got really interesting because they already heard the rumors of what was going on, the gun confiscation inside New Orleans, inside the city. And so before they were going to be deployed on the way there, they got together and talked. And it was, I believe, the presence of one particular person, Staff Sergeant Joshua May, that really made the difference. I mean, we don't know what would have happened if he hadn't been there, but because he was there and because he was the go-to guy on the Constitution, he'd always been talking about the Constitution. When the chips were down, they came to him and they all talked among each other, and they decided they weren't going to go along with any such orders. And so they informed their command in advance, like a preemptive refusal. And I think it's two things. One, he was there. Long before that happened, he had prepared the ground by teaching them about talking about the Constitution, and in particular, the right to bear arms, one that he considered really important. And so they had already had lots of discussions about it in advance. That's an important point. It's tough to do the right thing when you think about it for the very first time under pressure. And so it's much easier to decide in advance what you're going to do. I mean, look, the military does it all the time, right? You train for a ship fire, you go through your drills, you know exactly what you're going to do when things hit the fan. Same goes for infantry. You train for your immediate action drills. You train for your reaction to close range ambush, your reaction to long range ambush, et cetera, et cetera. You do these plays like a football team. So inside your head, you know what you're going to do in advance, which helps you to do the right thing, what you're trained to do, under duress. If you don't think about it, imagine you infantrymen out there. Imagine going into infantry combat having never prepared or planned or trained for what you're going to do. I mean, come on. So you got to prepare in advance. Same thing goes here. When you're going to decide when you make a decision ahead of time, what you're not going to do is certain things you're not going to go along with. You need to do that in advance. And Staff Sergeant Joshua May had prepared the ground. But the other thing that was there was that he was there on the spot when the chips came down. He was the guy who was resolute. He was the guy who was not going to waver. And he was the one who said, this is, once they found out the facts in Katrina, I'm sure he was the very first one to say, this is wrong. You cannot do this. And so they talked among themselves. And he was also the guy who stepped up and went and talked to the commander. I mean, it's just interesting. He's an NCO, and yet officers, lieutenants and captains, asked a sergeant to go talk to the commander. And so, yes, one key individual in the right place at the right time can make all the difference in the world. And that's why it's so critical for all of you out there in the military. Don't think to yourselves that you have to be, you think, I'm only one guy, what can I do? You can influence everybody else. You can be that little push to push the tipping point over to the side of doing what's right, rather than defaulting into just following orders and then winding up down the road, looking back on it and going, oh man, we did the wrong thing, like what happened at My Lai. So one person in the right place at the right time can make a critical difference, especially if they know what they're talking about. They are somebody who the others in the unit respect because they know what they're talking about, and if they've prepared the ground. And one more thing I want to say about Sergeant Joshua May. When he first came to that Utah National Guard unit, there was another sergeant ahead of him who was senior to him, who is the one who played that role when Sergeant May came to the unit. Sergeant May came to this unit, and this older sergeant said, hey, have you read the Constitution? And Sergeant Joshua May said, well, I have to admit I have not. And the guy said, well, how are you going to defend something you haven't read? How are you going to keep your oath to defend it if you have not read it? And so he kind of pricked Sergeant Joshua May's conscience. And so then Sergeant May went and read the Constitution and said, you're right, I can't defend it if I don't know it. So he started studying it, and this other sergeant encouraged him to keep going. And then that sergeant left, went to a different unit, and so Sergeant May became that guy in the unit who was the go-to guy on the Constitution, who was always prodding the other men in the unit to learn the Constitution, study it, and talking about current events. So he took that role on. So really you can look back and say, okay, you can trace the outcome in Katrina to that mass unit stand down. You can trace it actually to that other sergeant who planted the seed and said, hey, you need to know the Constitution, you need to be ready to refuse unlawful orders, and then he left and went someplace else, but he had planted that seed. And this is long before Oath Keepers existed. So, this is not something that doesn't happen in the military. The whole point of Oath Keepers is, we're not reinventing or not inventing anything new. The oath has always been there, and the founders put it there for good reason. But it's something that has been kind of suppressed, and the awareness of the Constitution is something that's been put on the back burner or even in the closet. And so it's up to individuals in the military to be like that NCO who helped Sergeant May learn the Constitution, or be like Sergeant May and be that guy in the unit, that go-to guy on the Constitution, and bring back a renaissance of awareness of the Constitution. You swore an oath to it, so you need to understand it, and then get those around you to understand it and prepare that ground, both inside yourself, prepare for what you're going to do and not going to do, and then also help prepare them so that in advance they thought about it, talked about it, so when they're under duress, they're more likely to do the right thing.
And what's really powerful about this approach is it's not just legal to prepare the ground in this way. I mean, you've already sworn an oath to it. So every person that's in that command and control structure already should be in line with this, and you're just reaffirming it. And so, I mean, people still do have their freedom of speech. If you don't have your freedom of speech, well, then we're already past the point of no return, which I would say.
Well, like you said, though, it's actually your duty. It's part of your duty. Like I said, the founders put that oath there for a reason. And I'm sure if you asked them, they would have said, well, of course, you have to know it. How are you going to keep the oath to defend it if you don't know it? So, yeah, you have a duty to do this, not just that you have a right of free speech. You have a duty and obligation to talk to your fellow soldiers, and NCOs, officers, whatever they are, and make sure that they understand, that you all understand. If you obey orders, like Lieutenant Calley did and other men underneath him in the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, if you obey orders that are later on ruled to be unlawful, you're also on the hook. So you're on the hook either way. So you might as well do what's right.
Could you go into what actually happened in the My Lai massacre a little bit? Because I don't think everybody in the audience might be familiar with that.
Well, what happened there is that there had been fire taken from various villages and killed men in a particular unit. And then the unit went into one village of My Lai, and the men basically extracted revenge, and they extracted revenge against women and children. Now they were their defense was they were given orders to do this, that their orders were to go in and wipe the village out, things like that. But obviously, it was a violation of laws of war to shoot little babies and little children and old ladies and women holding their children in their hands. That was an obvious violation of laws of war. But Lieutenant Calley and others under his command who had done this, they defended themselves by saying we were following orders from higher up. And there's a lot of controversy about whether there were orders from higher up to do these things. But the point is that was unlawful, clearly. And two, even if they were given orders from above to do this, that is no defense. Just as the Nazis found out at Nuremberg after World War II, we tried some Nazi leaders for war crimes. Their defense was also we were just following orders. Well, just following orders does not cut it under the UCMJ, under the laws of war, and it doesn't cut it also under our Constitution. So that's the whole point of My Lai. Like I said yesterday, there's a contrast there between an oath breaker, that's Lieutenant Calley, and an oath keeper, small o, small k. A man who kept his oath and did what was right was Warrant Officer Thompson, who stopped the My Lai massacre. He flew in on his choppers, saw what was going on, landed, instructed his crew that, if they fire upon me or fire upon any more women and children, you have my permission to open fire on them. I want you to open fire on them with the M60s on the choppers. And he went in to where the women and children were hiding, those who were still alive, and personally escorted them back to his chopper. So, contrast between Lieutenant Calley and Warrant Officer Thompson. One man who either lost it and did stuff that he never should have done, but then tried to defend himself by saying he was just following orders, and Warrant Officer Thompson who put a stop to it.
Yeah, it's a really powerful example because that's a higher degree
one
of
man.
Yeah.
Once again,
and it's a higher degree of escalation. I mean, it's one thing. I think that the first example, I think, is where we need to deal with it. We need to deal with it when it's just words in the beginning, but
right.
In the end, if we don't deal with it before then, it might be in a situation like that where somebody is being dragged out of their home, and you've got to make a decision, and it's not going to be an easy decision. And I wouldn't want to be the guy who's in that position to make that. But if your people are honest and look at where this country is headed, I don't think that's far fetched.
No, it's not. And we need to look at history. Truly, those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat it. And so, like I was telling you yesterday, I recently interviewed a woman who grew up as a young girl in Nazi Germany, and a gentleman who grew up in the USSR. And we'll have their videos up as soon as we process them. But they both said the same thing. What's happening in this country now is exactly what they saw happen in Soviet Russia under Stalin, and in Germany under the Nazis. It's the same pattern of arbitrary government, unrestrained government, totalitarian government is being put in place here, and the same fear in the population. And that's why as the military should plan on thinking about this in advance and even doing preemptory refusals. A preemptory refusal is interesting because, like you were just saying, it's you're not in the heat of the moment yet. You have not even been given the orders, but you're letting them know, and you're also reaffirming in your own head that you will not do that. So it's actually a nice way to, I don't want to say game the system, but a nice way to take care of things in advance of the orders. You haven't been given an order yet, so now what are you doing? You're not refusing orders, but you're just letting them know you won't do this. And so now there can be a debate, even before the orders are given, before there's heat under the circumstances, and then you can see where your commander's head's at, and you'll know by his response, and so that's a nice indicator for you, but it's also a good indicator for him. It lets him know that he better be thinking about what orders he tries to give you. So the downside is you could be purged, no doubt about it. There could be repercussions, but that's why it's kind of nice to have a mass unit stand down. But regardless, I think it's important to draw these lines ahead of time and have discussions. And part of that discussion is the preemptive refusal, because now you're talking to your command. You're saying, sir, I hear that these orders may be coming down in the future. I just want to let you know that this is something I consider to be unlawful because of the violation of the Constitution for the following reasons. Like with the NDAA, it's a clear violation of Article 3, Section 2, and Section 3, the Treason Clause. So you can talk about that ahead of time, just like Sergeant Joshua May talked to all his fellow soldiers about the importance of the the Second Amendment and how it's key within our Bill of Rights. And I'm not sure what other conversations he had, but he was always talking about the Constitution and talking about the Bill of Rights, and they definitely had covered the Second Amendment, because when they got down there, they were all looking at each other, going, "Wait a minute, that's not right," and they were correct. It was not right. Well, I mean, look at like we said last time, look at the mass stand down in 1989 East Germany as like the ideal model of if all of the military does it, then the corrupt, illegitimate, murderous government, which East Germany was, man. I mean, you tried to go across the wire, across the wall before that, they would kill you. And in fact, there's the video on our site, an interview with a gentleman named Gunther Spence, who was a lieutenant colonel in the East German military when the wall came down. He's now an oath keeper in Texas. I encourage you to go. He's right there, right above Sergeant Joshua May, right below him, whichever one it is, on our site, is a video of Gunther Spence. Watch that interview. He talks about what happened when the wall came down, in his thick East German accent. So, but by the time 1989 rolled around, there was a tipping point in the whole population. 80 to 90%, about 90% of the population, did not want to live under communism anymore. They knew it was a lie. They knew they were being deceived. They could see what life was like in West Germany. They had relatives over there. They could see West German television and hear the radio. They knew that they were being, living under a horribly repressive system, and so they wanted out. And that was true across the spectrum of the population, including inside the military. And so I'm not sure where exactly that tipping point is, but there came a certain point of illegitimacy in the mass consciousness of the country. And once that was reached, really it was done. Because by the time, and it built up through massive peaceful protests, and the civil disobedience is a very powerful tool. A lot of people in the freedom movement or the patriot movement, they kind of scoff at civil disobedience, like, oh, under Hitler, Gandhi would have just been killed. That's true. But when you're talking about your own people, your own population, what you do in your protests matters to those inside the military. That is your actual audience, not so much the corrupt politicians and leaders. You're not going to prick their conscience. They haven't got one for the most part. But where it's going to make a difference is in the perception of the military and the police and the broader population. That's why Martin Luther King, juxtapose him with Malcolm X. Martin Luther King in the end was more successful because he had an ability to influence the mass population, which did have power. In a totalitarian regime like Nazi Germany, it probably wouldn't have worked. It had just been killed. But where you have power still in the hands of the people, it can make a difference. And I would submit that our power is not just among the civilian population in this country, but also inside the military. They're your prime audience. When you use civil disobedience and you turn the other cheek, you allow yourself to get pepper sprayed, you allow yourself to get beaten and arbitrarily arrested just for your free speech, that has an impact on the military. It worked in the Soviet Union when it fell. The same kind of thing happened there. Initially, there were orders to go and crush those protests, and about 20 very brave souls died, crushed by tanks and shot. But the massive peaceful protests refused to disperse. The Communist Party thought that once they ordered them to go in there, that people would become afraid. Once a few were killed, the rest of them would disperse. They did not. So they showed courage, but they didn't use violence. They just stayed right there, and that helped to tip the military on the side of the people. And the rest of the military stood down. After those initial orders were followed and 20 were killed, that was it. After that, they didn't do it anymore, and that fell also. And so there can be that tipping point. I mean, you might have to fight under, in the circumstances where either they bring in outside forces or there's mercenaries or your military is so corrupted that they're beyond hope. But we're not there, folks. If the military of a communist country, East Germany, or a communist country, the Soviet Union, if they can do the right thing once that tipping point is reached, then our guys certainly can too. Okay? So don't forsake them.
Yeah.
Don't give up on them. Don't give up on them. Yeah.
That's really powerful. Yeah, because it gives it's a different perspective. People are generally thinking that they have to get the government to listen. They're not going to listen. They're not. It's just not going to happen. But the military, those are real people, and I'm being contacted by these guys, and it moves me to see how much their hearts are being affected by what they're seeing. I mean, these guys really do feel this. I mean, most of these people, most of the people who join the military are really patriotic Americans who want to do the right thing, and they didn't see where the system was going when they got in. Probably a lot of them didn't, and now they're faced with a very, very difficult situation that none of us would want to be facing. And we have to support them in a positive way, not throwing eggs at them and condemning them for the situation that they're facing, but to give them moral support. And I think that's really, really key.
It is, and it's important for them not to feel alone. That's why they should be talking to each other. If they want to do that in their off time or on the down low, that's up to them. But they should be talking about. I mean, and this is not subversion, guys. This is your responsibility. You're supposed to go and learn the Constitution. You're supposed to figure out in advance, lawful and unlawful orders. You're supposed to know these things. And I want to say one last thing about that. They do get training under the UCMJ and under the laws of war. They do know what lawful and unlawful orders are in those contexts. And that would be sufficient if they were only used overseas on foreign battlefields. But now, when they're increasingly used here at home, like in Katrina, that was a domestic deployment of the military. When they're used like that, then they run right up against our Bill of Rights, which protects our rights here in the United States. And so it's not enough to know the UCMJ, not enough to know the laws of war. They need to know the Constitution if they're going to be, used here at home. And we can talk about the legitimacy of even using the military here at home. I don't think it's legitimate. We're supposed to be us as the militia, who are internal security to suppress insurrections, repel invasions, or execute the laws of the Union, not the standing army. Okay? But we can talk about that another time.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Stuart, for coming on. I really appreciate that, and appreciate your
Right?
work. Once again, his website, oathkeepers.org. Go to that site. If you're police and military, please consider joining, making a donation. We really have to support these guys. They're the last line of defense.